The morning sun filtered through the oak trees as I guided my grandfather's restored John Deere tractor across what remained of our once vast farmland. The familiar rumble beneath me connected me to 3 generations of Mitchell farmers who had worked this soil since 1937. Now our 100 acres had dwindled to just 5. The rest sold off to developers to pay for my father's cancer treatments. The irony was not lost on me that our family land had been transformed into the very subdivision I now reluctantly called home, Oak Ridge Estates. I never planned to live under an HOA's authority. The thought would have made my grandfather turn in his grave. But after Dad passed, the medical bills left few options. At least I had managed to keep this small parcel with the original farmhouse, situated at the edge of the new development. The developers had been eager to include my property in their plans, offering slightly better terms if I agreed to join their homeowners association. What choice did I have? 2 weeks after moving in, the first sign of trouble appeared. A laminated notice affixed to my mailbox with clear packing tape. Violation: unauthorized agricultural equipment visible from street. The bright red lettering seemed to shout from the page. I was still holding it when a shadow fell across the paper. "You must be James Mitchell," a voice chirped with artificial warmth. "I am Marguerite Wilkins, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." I turned to find a woman in her 50s, clipboard clutched against a pastel cardigan, designer sunglasses perched atop a meticulously highlighted bob. Her smile remained fixed in place, never quite reaching her eyes. "Nice to meet you," I replied, extending my hand. "Is there a problem?" Marguerite glanced toward my driveway, where the John Deere sat gleaming in the morning light. Dad and I had spent his final good months restoring it together. "I am afraid that vehicle violates our community standards," she said, consulting her clipboard unnecessarily. "Commercial and agricultural equipment cannot be stored in view of the street." I took a deep breath. This tractor is not commercial. It is for maintaining my property. These 5 acres need proper equipment. "Your farming days are over, Mr. Mitchell," she said with a dismissive wave. "This is a prestigious residential community now." I gestured to my land behind the house. "I still grow vegetables on 2 acres. The tractor is essential for tilling and maintenance. The HOA agreement I signed included an exception for my agricultural activities on this parcel." Her smile tightened. "We can discuss this at the next board meeting. Meanwhile, please store your equipment out of sight." Over the next week, I pored through the HOA documentation. The bylaws were confusingly written, with contradictions between sections. My property specifically had an amendment mentioning continued limited agricultural use, but equipment storage was ambiguously addressed at best. More troubling were the whispers I began hearing from neighbors. Mrs. Chen, who lived across the street, stopped by with a housewarming plant. "Be careful with Marguerite," she warned quietly. "She has been targeting certain homeowners since she became president. Last year, the Garcias were fined repeatedly for their vegetable garden until they finally moved." 2 days later, Mr. Davenport from down the block introduced himself while I was checking my mail. "Your tractor has become quite the topic at the community center," he said. "Some residents admire it, actually. Reminds them of their own rural childhoods." "And the others?" I asked. He lowered his voice. "Marguerite has a faction that follows her lead. They are already complaining about property values, but many of us are tired of her reign. We just have not found a way to stand up to her yet." As I walked back to my house, I noticed Marguerite parked across the street, photographing my tractor with her smartphone. Our eyes met briefly before she drove away. I could feel the battle lines being drawn, dividing neighbor from neighbor. This was no longer just about a piece of farm equipment. It was about whether I would surrender my heritage to appease those who valued uniformity above all else. That evening, I moved the tractor to the side of my driveway and covered it with a tarp, not hiding it completely but making a gesture of compromise. By morning, the tarp had been removed and a second violation notice awaited me. The message was clear: no compromise would be accepted. Total compliance was the only option. The certified letter arrived on Tuesday afternoon. I signed for it with growing unease, recognizing the Oak Ridge Estates letterhead through the envelope window. Inside, the official warning was printed on heavy paper with the HOA logo embossed in gold at the top. Per Section 834 of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association bylaws, commercial vehicles are prohibited from being stored or parked in residential driveways or visible from the street. Your agricultural tractor constitutes a commercial vehicle and must be removed within 7 days or fines of $100 per day will commence, potentially resulting in a lien against your property. I spread the documents across my kitchen table that evening. The warning letter, bylaws, my purchase agreement, and printouts of the sparse email exchanges with the board. Section 834 addressed commercial vehicles, but made no specific mention of agricultural equipment. More importantly, my specific property had an addendum acknowledging its partial agricultural use. I highlighted relevant passages and began compiling a formal response. Every interaction needed documentation now. I started a detailed log, noting dates, times, and content of all communications. I installed a security camera covering my driveway and the street in front of my house. When Marguerite drove by slowly the next morning, her presence was dutifully recorded in 1080p resolution. My research into HOA regulations revealed that proper procedures included a hearing before enforcement actions. The letter had conveniently skipped mentioning this detail. I carefully crafted my response, citing the relevant legal statutes and requesting a formal hearing as was my right. 3 days later, I stood before the HOA board in the community center conference room. 6 board members sat at a long table, with Marguerite at the center. I had prepared a reasonable presentation, complete with photographs of my property, highlighting how the tractor was essential for maintaining my unique parcel. The bylaws explicitly state that my property maintains limited agricultural usage rights, I explained, pointing to the relevant documentation. The tractor is necessary for that permitted use and does not constitute a commercial vehicle as defined in Section 834. I noticed most board members checking their watches or scrolling through their phones. My words were falling on deliberately deaf ears. "This is not some country backwater," Marguerite announced, drawing scattered laughter from 2 board members. "There are standards here that all residents must abide by. The board has determined your equipment violates our aesthetic guidelines." "But there has been no formal vote," I objected, "and the specific exemption for my property." "We will take your concerns under advisement," she interrupted, already gathering her papers. "Next item on the agenda." I remained seated as they moved on to discussing community garden planning. The dismissal was so blatant that even a few residents in attendance exchanged uncomfortable glances. As the meeting concluded, I lingered near the exit, hopping to speak with individual board members. That was when I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. Marguerite stood near the refreshment table, speaking with a man I did not recognize. 2 or 3 more this month should meet our quota," she said softly. "Your brother does good work. The Mitchell property should be next. That tractor is an eyesore." Standard commission structure, the man asked. Of course, Marguerite replied. Eagle Towing always gets our business. I discreetly reached for my phone, opening the voice recorder app as I pretended to check messages. Moving cautiously closer, I positioned myself within range. Between the towing fees and the HOA fines, these violations are quite profitable, Marguerite continued, and no one ever fights back effectively. The realization hit me with stunning clarity. This was never about neighborhood aesthetics or property values. It was about control and profit. The towing company, apparently owned by someone's brother, received business while the HOA collected fines. A perfect racket with residents as unwitting victims. I walked to my car feeling both angry and oddly relieved. The true nature of the conflict was now clear. This was not a legitimate enforcement of reasonable rules. It was exploitation, plain and simple, and I had it recorded. That night, I backed up the audio file to multiple locations and continued my research into state HOA regulations. If Marguerite wanted a fight, she would get one, but not the kind she was expecting. The grinding of gears and the piercing beep of a revering truck tore me from sleep at 5:43 a.m. I lurched upright, momentarily disoriented until the sound registered. Through my bedroom window, the scene unfolded in the gray pre-dawn light. A flatbed tow truck with Eagle Towing, emblazoned on its side, was positioning itself behind my grandfather's tractor. I threw off the covers and raced downstairs, not bothering with shoes or a robe. The front door banged against the wall as I burst outside, barefoot in pajama pants and a faded t-shirt, my voice hoarse with disbelief and rage. "What do you think you are doing?" I shouted, sprinting across the damp grass toward the driver who was already securing chains around the tractor's rear axle. The man looked up, startled by my sudden appearance. He was middle-aged with a weathered face and a company logo on his breast pocket. Behind him stood a second figure I had not initially noticed, Marguerite Wilkins, arms crossed with satisfaction. "This vehicle is being impounded for HOA violations," the driver stated flatly, returning to his work. "Under whose authority?" I demanded, moving between him and the tractor. "There has been no final ruling on this matter." "I have proper authorization," he replied, fumbling in his pocket for paperwork. He withdrew a form and held it out to me. I snatched the document, my hands trembling with anger and the morning chill. My phone was still in my pajama pocket, and I discreetly began recording video. The authorization form bore Marguerite's flowery signature and yesterday's date, before any final decision had been rendered by the full board as required by the HOA's own bylaws. "This is not valid," I stated firmly. "HOA regulations require a full board vote and proper notification before enforcement. You have neither." Marguerite stepped forward. "The violation is clear, Mr. Mitchell. The board has authorized me to act on its behalf in these matters." By now, lights were flickering on in neighboring houses. My raised voice had drawn attention, and several residents emerged onto porches or driveways, curious about the commotion. Mrs. Chen appeared in a floral bathrobe, followed by the Davenports from the corner lot. "Show me the legal notice of violation," I demanded repeatedly, making sure my phone captured everything. "Show me the board vote documentation." The driver looked increasingly uncomfortable, glancing between me and Marguerite. He could produce only the single authorization form with her signature, nothing from the full board. "I just go where they tell me," he muttered. Mrs. Chen had moved closer, her arms wrapped around herself against the morning chill. "They tried to tow my son's car last month," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, for a supposed parking violation that was not in the bylaws. Mr. Davenport joined us, still in striped pajamas. They threatened to put a lien on our house over a disputed late payment, he added, even though we had bank records proving it was paid on time. One by one, neighbors approached, sharing similar stories of arbitrary enforcement and intimidation. The driver, sensing the shift in atmosphere, began removing the chains from my tractor. "Listen, I do not want any trouble," he said quietly. "But this is the third special job this month that Marguerite has called in personally. Usually, these things have proper paperwork." I continued recording as the driver packed up his equipment. Marguerite stood rigid with anger, her carefully constructed authority eroding before her eyes as neighbors openly questioned her actions. "This is not over, Mr. Mitchell," she hissed as she walked back to her car. "The board will address your continued violations appropriately." As the tow truck pulled away, empty except for the driver's wounded pride, I turned to the small crowd that had gathered in and around my driveway. The sun was now cresting the horizon, painting the scene in soft golden light. Mrs. Chen patted my arm supportively. "She has been doing this since taking over as president," she explained. "Targeting certain homeowners, collecting fines, calling in towing services without proper authorization. Most people eventually give in. Or move out," added Mr. Davenport. "The Garcias, the Patels, the Hendersons, all driven away by selective enforcement and harassment." A younger woman I had not met before stepped forward. "I am Lisa Weathers," she said. "I work in accounting. The HOA financial reports have been suspiciously vague since Marguerite took over. Many of us have questions about where all the fine money is going." I looked around at the faces of my neighbors, concerned, supportive, and for the first time, openly defiant of the status quo. What had begun as a personal battle over my tractor had revealed something much larger, a pattern of abuse affecting the entire community. "We should document everything," I suggested. "Gather evidence, compare experiences, review the financial records. If what we suspect is true, this goes beyond simple power tripping. It could be actual fraud." Heads nodded in agreement. Phone numbers were exchanged, and impromptu plans made to meet later. As the neighbors dispersed to prepare for their workdays, I stood in my driveway looking at my grandfather's tractor gleaming in the morning light. It was more than a piece of equipment now. It had become a symbol of resistance against petty tyranny. I patted its worn leather seat, feeling a connection not just to my family's past, but to a new purpose. This battle had transformed from personal survival to community resistance, and Marguerite had no idea what she had just unleashed. My dining room table disappeared beneath stacks of documents by the end of the week. HOA financial statements obtained through formal requests, property records, board meeting minutes from the past 5 years, and a growing collection of testimonials from neighbors. Each piece added to a troubling mosaic that suggested systematic abuse of power. I had taken a week off from my remote engineering job to focus on this investigation. The deeper I dug, the more concerning patterns emerged. Selective enforcement against certain homeowners, mysterious budget allocations to vaguely named consultant services, a pattern of board members' relatives receiving maintenance contracts without competitive bidding. Most telling was the spike in towing services and fines since Marguerite had become president 3 years ago. Revenue from penalties had increased nearly 400%. Yet the financial statements showed no corresponding improvement in community amenities or services. The money was flowing somewhere, but not back into Oak Ridge Estates. I contacted Rachel Simmons, an attorney specializing in HOA law, sending her the documentation I had gathered. She agreed to meet at my home to review the findings. "They have overstepped their authority repeatedly," she confirmed after reviewing my materials for nearly 2 hours. Her pen tapped rhythmically against her legal pad as she organized her thoughts. "The towing attempt without proper notice or hearing alone violates state regulations, and these financial irregularities," she gestured to the spreadsheets I had compiled, "warrant deeper investigation." "What options do we have?" I asked. "Individual homeowners challenging HOA actions rarely succeed," she admitted. "But a coordinated effort by multiple residents, especially with evidence of procedural violations and possible financial impropriety, that changes the equation entirely." The doorbell rang just as Rachel was explaining the process for demanding a forensic audit. Mrs. Chen and Mr. Davenport stood on my porch, followed by retired Judge Morris, whom I had not met before, and several other neighbors. Our newly formed Oak Ridge Homeowners Defense Coalition was arriving for its first official meeting. I welcomed them into my living room, hastily arranging chairs in a circle. Introductions revealed a surprisingly powerful assemblage of skills. Lisa Weathers, the accountant; Judge Morris, with 30 years on the bench; Sam Rodriguez, a paralegal; and 8 other homeowners who had experienced similar targeting by the HOA board. "I pulled the incorporation documents," Sam explained, spreading papers on the coffee table. "The HOA bylaws actually give homeowners the right to call an emergency meeting with signatures from just 20% of residents. We already have nearly that many just in this room." Judge Morris spoke next, his voice carrying the quiet authority of decades on the bench. "What they failed to realize about this community is that beneath our suburban veneer, we have a farmer who understands persistence, a retired judge who knows the law, an accountant who can follow the money, and enough righteous anger to fuel a revolution." The room filled with determined nods and murmurs of agreement. For many, this was the first time they had felt empowered against the arbitrary rules and enforcement that had dominated their neighborhood lives. Lisa Weathers had been reviewing the financial documents I had obtained. "These consultant fees," she pointed to several entries, "are being paid to an LLC registered to Marguerite's home address, and the landscaping contract went to her husband's company without any competitive bidding. That violates both HOA rules and possibly state law." For hours, we strategized and organized. Each person took responsibilities suited to their skills. Judge Morris would review legal options. Lisa would analyze the financial records more deeply. Others would collect signatures and testimonials from additional neighbors. As midnight approached and the meeting began to wind down, I walked everyone to the door. Mrs. Chen lingered behind. "You know they will come after your tractor again," she warned. "Marguerite will not back down easily." "I am counting on it," I replied, "but next time we will be ready." After everyone left, I stood in my darkened living room looking through the window at my grandfather's tractor, now illuminated by security lights I had installed. For a moment, I could almost see Dad sitting there, nodding his approval. I realized we were no longer fighting about a piece of farm equipment. We were reclaiming our neighborhood from those who had weaponized the very rules designed to protect it. The tractor had become not just my hill to die on, but the rallying point for a community finding its voice. Tomorrow would bring more research, more planning, but tonight had shown me something crucial. I was not alone, and neither were the other victims of Marguerite's reign. The final notice arrived by courier 3 days later. The envelope contained a single page with bold text declaring "Final Warning" at the top. Tomorrow's date was circled in aggressive red marker. The message was clear: remove the tractor or it would be impounded at my expense, with daily fines accumulating immediately. Marguerite had bypassed the standard process entirely, ignored our formal appeals, and made her move. She clearly expected me to either comply or face overwhelming financial consequences. It was a strategy that had worked countless times before. I called an emergency meeting of our coalition. Within an hour, my living room filled with determined neighbors. Judge Morris examined the notice with a frown. "This violates at least 3 provisions of state law regarding HOA enforcement," he noted. "But they are counting on you not knowing that or not being willing to fight it in court." Lisa Weathers had completed her analysis of the HOA finances. "We have enough evidence to warrant a formal investigation," she reported. "Over $67,000 in questionable payments to entities connected to board members in the past year alone." Our coalition had grown to represent 28 households, well over the threshold required to call an emergency community meeting. We had already submitted the formal request, but Marguerite had ignored it, another violation of the bylaws. "They expect you to either move the tractor or lose it tomorrow," said Mr. Davenport. "They are not expecting a counteroffensive." As the meeting continued, a plan took shape, bold, possibly risky, but potentially decisive. By midnight, we had organized the mounting evidence of financial impropriety and procedural violations into clear, compelling binders. Judge Morris confirmed what we already suspected. The HOA had no legal standing for their threatened action, but they were counting on intimidation to prevail as it had so many times before. "Are you sure about this?" Mrs. Chen asked as the others departed. "It could escalate things significantly." I nodded, determination replacing any lingering doubt. Sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to stand up in a way they cannot ignore. At 4:30 a.m., my alarm pulled me from a fitful sleep. I dressed quickly in the darkness and walked out to the driveway where my grandfather's John Deere waited, covered in morning dew. I ran my hand along its cool metal frame, thinking of all it represented, not just my family's history now, but a community's stand against corruption. I climbed into the familiar seat and started the engine, its diesel rumble breaking the pre-dawn silence. Neighbors who were part of our plan had left porch lights on in solidarity, small beacons in the darkness. Slowly, I backed the tractor out of the driveway and onto the empty street. With careful precision, I drove through the sleeping neighborhood toward the ornate entrance gates of Oak Ridge Estates, the only vehicle access point for the entire development. The gates stood open as they always did overnight, flanked by decorative stone columns and manicured shrubbery. I positioned the massive machine directly across the entrance, its wide body and blade completely blocking the roadway. The tractor did not impede the adjacent pedestrian gate, and I had carefully ensured that emergency vehicles could still access the neighborhood through the service road on the eastern perimeter. This was about making a point, not creating a safety hazard. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I secured a laminated notice to the tractor's blade. The document had been carefully crafted with Judge Morris's guidance. "Attention RESID and TS. This temporary inconvenience is the result of ongoing HOA violations of state law. Documentation of financial irregularities and improper enforcement actions is available at oakridgetruth.com. Emergency vehicles have alternative access via the Eastern Service Road. Regular access will resume when the board agrees to an emergency community meeting. We apologize for this necessary action. Below this message was a QR code linking to a website where our coalition had uploaded evidence of the HOA's misconduct, including the recorded conversation between Marguerite and the towing company owner. I walked home in the growing light, adrenaline making my heart pound. By 6:15 a.m., the first residents attempting to leave for work discovered the blockade. By 6:30, my phone began buzzing with text messages, mostly supportive, a few confused, only a handful angry. Judge Morris, Mrs. Chen, and several other coalition members had stationed themselves near the entrance, calmly explaining the situation and distributing printed packets detailing years of HOA abuses and the specific illegal actions threatened against my property. By 7:30 a.m., a small crowd had gathered. Some residents had to leave their vehicles behind and walk out to meet rideshares beyond the gates. Others called in to work, unexpectedly drawn into neighborhood drama they had previously ignored. I watched from my front porch as the community awakened to both a physical blockade and the metaphorical roadblock that had been quietly constricting their rights for years. My phone rang constantly, neighbors offering support, local news asking questions, and finally, the call I had been waiting for. "This is outrageous," Marguerite hissed. "Remove that monstrosity immediately or face legal consequences." "I am simply storing my tractor in a new location," I replied calmly. "I believe there is precedent for moving vehicles without proper notice or authorization. Your towing company taught me that." "This is different and you know it," she sputtered. "Yes, it is," I agreed, "because I am prepared to move my tractor the moment you agree to an emergency community meeting as required by our bylaws when petitioned by 20% of homeowners. We submitted that petition 3 days ago." The silence on the other end told me everything. She had not expected organized resistance on this scale. The balance of power had shifted, and she knew it. "7 p.m. tonight," she finally conceded. "Community Center." "We will be there," I replied, with documentation ready for all residents to review. I ended the call and looked out at the neighborhood stirring to life under the morning sun. The opening move in our endgame had been played. Now we would see if justice could prevail against entrenched corruption. Marguerite's luxury SUV screeched to a halt 50 yards from the blocked gate at precisely 8:17 a.m. She emerged like a thundercloud, designer heels clicking aggressively against the pavement. Board members Reynolds and Townsend trailed nervously behind her, clearly uncomfortable with the growing crowd of residents gathered near my tractor. "This is criminal behavior," she shouted, smartphone raised to record what she clearly anticipated would be my humiliation and surrender. Her normally perfectly styled hair was slightly disheveled, suggesting she had rushed out without her usual meticulous preparation. Instead of finding me isolated and vulnerable, she faced not just me, but over 40 residents surrounding the tractor in a protective semicircle. Many held coffee cups and pastries provided by Mrs. Chen's daughter, who had turned the blockade into an impromptu community breakfast. "Criminal behavior is an interesting topic to raise," Judge Morris projected from beside me, his voice carrying the practiced authority that had commanded courtrooms for 3 decades. The crowd quieted immediately. "Perhaps we should discuss the illegal towing authorization without proper notice," he continued, gesturing to copies of the documentation being distributed among residents. "Or the no-bid contracts to your husband's landscaping company, or the $67,000 in unexplained administrative fees paid to an LLC registered to your home address." The crowd's murmur grew louder with each accusation. Marguerite's face flushed as she realized she had walked into a carefully orchestrated confrontation with an audience of her neighbors. "These are baseless accusations," she sputtered, looking to Reynolds and Townsend for support. They stood frozen, clearly processing the implications for their own reputations and possibly legal standing. Mrs. Chen stepped forward from the crowd, a small woman made larger by righteous indignation. "You fined me $500 for my garden statues," she said clearly. "Called them culturally inappropriate decorations while board members have violations that go unaddressed. My koi pond was approved, then suddenly violated code after I questioned the special assessment," added another neighbor I recognized as Dr. Williams. One by one, residents stepped forward with stories of selective enforcement, arbitrary rulings, and intimidation. What had begun as my isolated battle over a tractor had catalyzed a community-wide reckoning with years of accumulated grievances. Mr. Davenport raised his voice above the growing crowd. "They threatened foreclosure over a disputed late payment," he recounted. "Even when bank records proved it had been submitted on time, they added administrative fees that mysteriously disappeared from the books." Marguerite attempted to regain control, her voice rising to compete with the groundswell of testimony. "These matters can be addressed through proper channels," she insisted. "This illegal blockade is not the way civilized people handle disputes." "We tried proper channels," I responded, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Our petition for an emergency meeting was ignored. Our questions about financial discrepancies went unanswered. The proper channels were deliberately blocked." A white van with the Channel 7 News logo rolled to a stop near the gathering. A reporter and cameraman quickly assembled their equipment, drawn by an anonymous tip about community unrest and allegations of HOA corruption. Marguerite's eyes widened at the sight of media attention. "Who called the press?" she demanded, voice suddenly less certain. "The same person who will be calling state regulators if we do not get full transparency," responded Lisa Weathers, stepping forward with a thick folder of financial analysis. "As a certified public accountant, I am prepared to testify about the irregularities I have found in the HOA books." Marguerite's face cycled through expressions of outrage, shock, and finally something I had never seen before: fear. She glanced at the growing media presence, the swelling crowd of neighbors, and the damning documentation being openly shared. "Emergency community meeting," she finally conceded, voice barely audible over the crowd's energy. "Tonight, 7 p.m. And I want every financial record for the past 5 years available for review," added Lisa firmly, "or we file complaints with state regulators tomorrow morning." Marguerite nodded stiffly, then turned to retreat to her vehicle. Reynolds and Townsend followed, their earlier confidence replaced by visible concern about their own complicity. As they drove away, a spontaneous cheer erupted from the gathered residents. Neighbors who had lived beside each other for years without meaningful connection were suddenly united in common purpose. The reporter approached, asking for statements about the situation. Judge Morris handled the media with practiced ease, outlining the concerns without making specific accusations that could lead to legal complications. Meanwhile, I slipped away to move my tractor, fulfilling our part of the agreement now that the emergency meeting had been secured. As I climbed into the familiar seat and started the engine, residents applauded. What had been a tool for farming had transformed into something else entirely, a symbol of resistance against unchecked power. Tonight would determine whether that resistance could translate into lasting change for our community. The community center overflowed with residents that evening. Extra folding chairs had been hastily arranged in the parking lot with video feeds for those who could not fit inside. Nearly every household in Oak Ridge Estates was represented, a level of participation unprecedented in the HOA's history. Inside, the atmosphere crackled with tension as Marguerite and the remaining board members took their seats at the front table. Gone was her usual imperious confidence, replaced by a brittle defensiveness as she called the meeting to order. "We are here to address concerns about certain HOA policies," she began, attempting to control the narrative. "We are here to address documented violations of state law and HOA bylaws," Judge Morris corrected from the front row, "as well as financial irregularities that may constitute actionable offenses." At his signal, Lisa Weathers connected her laptop to the projector. 5 years of financial records appeared on screen, with suspicious transactions highlighted in red. The systematic pattern was unmistakable even to untrained eyes. Selective enforcement generating fines that disappeared into vaguely named administrative accounts, no-bid contracts to companies connected to board members, and discrepancies between reported expenses and actual services delivered. "This stops today," I declared, standing not as an outsider but as the voice of a united community. "Our coalition proposes an immediate vote of no confidence in the current board, followed by the election of an interim leadership committee until proper elections can be held." The vote was called and passed with overwhelming support. When faced with the choice between resignation or potential legal consequences, Marguerite and 2 board members surrendered their positions. The remaining members agreed to serve in caretaker roles until new elections could be organized. In their place, a transition committee was elected on the spot: Judge Morris, Mrs. Chen, myself, and 4 others representing diverse interests within Oak Ridge Estates. Our first action was adopting an updated set of bylaws that preserved necessary standards while eliminating subjective enforcement mechanisms. 3 months passed in a flurry of activity. Forensic accountants reviewed the books, identifying funds that could be recovered and returned to the community treasury. The landscaping contract was rebid, resulting in better service at lower cost. Most importantly, a culture of transparency and fairness began to replace the fear and resentment that had characterized Oak Ridge Estates for years. By summer, my grandfather's tractor sat proudly on my property, now officially designated as a heritage agricultural implement, under our new exemption for historical equipment. More importantly, it had become something of a community mascot. Children stopped to admire it on their way to school. Neighbors asked for rides during our newly established quarterly block parties. The community newsletter featured it in the masthead as a symbol of our neighborhood's transformation. On a warm Saturday in July, I was performing my weekend maintenance on the old John Deere when I noticed new residents moving in across the street. I waved them over, offering the traditional welcome gift our community now provided to all newcomers: a copy of our reasonable bylaws.